Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this special online History and Policy seminar. I'm Philip Murphy. I'm Director of History and Policy. This evening, we're going to talk about why history matters in government and whether history has been marginalised in the policymaking process and why this matters and the sort of problems that government seems to have around record keeping, around institutional memory, and around drawing on historical precedents. And our first speaker, Anthony Seldon, clearly feels that there are problems there and is going to talk about that. I'm going to keep the introductions very short because I think you'll be familiar with most of the people on the panel, I'm sure, and particularly you'll be familiar with Sir Anthony Seldon, who, along with Peter Hennessy, was the co-founder of the Institute of Contemporary British History back in 1986, and has championed the cause of contemporary history in the UK and been a tremendously important force in our field, in our discipline area. He was, as you'll know, the Master of Wellington College. He was Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham from 2015 to 2020. And he is a prolific author, very well known for his biographies, political biographies of a number of prime ministers: Margaret Thatcher, John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, most recently. So it's a great pleasure and great honor to have Anthony here. And Anthony will talk about his current work with Whitehall. And then our panelists will comment on this. And I'm sure, there's a huge amount of knowledge and experience within this virtual room. So please do use the chat function to ask questions. My colleague Jacob Forward will feed those questions into a discussion. We'll try and keep the last 30 minutes or so for you to deal with your questions. Let me just introduce the other panelists. We have my predecessor as Director of History and Policy, Professor Andrew Blick, who is Professor of Politics and Contemporary History and Head of the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. We have my colleague from the School of Advanced Study, Dr. Juanita Cox, who is one of the leading experts in the UK on the history of the UK's Caribbean diaspora community. Juanita is Research Fellow on our Windrush Scandal Oral History Project, looking at the scandal in a much broader transnational and Commonwealth context, and it's sometimes been looked at in the news. She is taught at the University of North London, and she produces a monthly community forum called Guyana Speaks, which you'll be able to see on Twitter. We have Dr. Duncan Needham, who is Dean and Senior Tutor at Darwin College, Cambridge, and he is also Director of the Centre of Financial History at the University of Cambridge. Duncan has particular area of expertise in the monetary and financial history of the UK, France, and Germany over the last 3 centuries. And he focuses on the intersection of economic theory and politics and financial markets. Alongside Duncan, we have Professor Sally Sheard, who's a health policy analyst and historian with a research focus in the interface between expert advisors and policymakers. Sally is Executive Dean of the Institute of Population Health at the University of Liverpool and is the lead on a Wellcome Trust project, an 8-year project, the governance of health, medical, economic, and managerial expertise in Britain since 1948. And last but not least, we have Professor Simon Streeter, who is one of the founders of History and Policy. Simon is Professor of History and Public Policy at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge. His latest book, After the Virus, Lessons from the Past for a Better Future, co-authored with his partner Hilary Cooper, was published last year. So those are our very distinguished panelists. Without further ado, let me hand over to Anthony to make some opening remarks.
Philip, thank you very much indeed. And when you were describing that, it feels a little bit as if I've died and I'm speaking to all of you back on Earth, planet Earth, from this remote place somewhere in the ether. But in fact, I haven't died yet. I am still here. I'm very pleased to be talking to you today about a topic that matters enormously. If history matters, then it should be mattering at the apex of decision making. If history doesn't matter, it wouldn't matter. But if we believe it does, there is no more important place for it to count than in the most important decisions that affect all our lives. And so today I see this very much as a discussion. I don't know an awful lot. I'll know much less than panelists and those who are tuning in from Earth. And I'm going to be learning a lot. I see this as a collaborative exercise. Can I just say very quickly, thanks to Philip, to Simon, to Duncan, as well as to my collaborators on the number 10 project, more on that a bit later, Andrew Blick and John Davis. Look, this is the question: should we be asking for parity of esteem for history with economics, with statistics, with science, with medicine? Why should there be chief scientific officers, medical officers, chief economists, chief statisticians, etc., but no chief historians? By the way, I don't think having a chief historian is necessarily the answer. It might not be any kind of answer, but the parity of esteem does matter. Have we missed a trick? Have we not punched above our weight? Have historians been too busy, intent, arguing with each other? Not that economists and scientists, medics and statisticians don't argue amply and abundantly and luxuriously with each other, but what has happened? And that's a question. And also it's a question to ask, which will run through the whole talk, Philip and everybody, which is, should we be looking to shift Whitehall decisively in the direction, and not just Whitehall, but the devolved administrations and local government, anywhere where political and administrative decisions are being taken, in the direction of at least a history-influenced policymaking process, if not a history-rich policymaking process? So those are my introductory comments, and just picking up one or two bits from my own experience. With Peter Hennessy, we introduced witness seminars, and part of that nearly 40 years ago was to bring together the makers of history with the students of history. And the first was indeed in Senate House, and it was on the Winter of Discontent. And there've been 120 of those. And I got the idea from the Firestone Library in Princeton, where the Foster Dulles papers were, and where a number of witness seminars had occurred. That was the straight feed through. And then, as mentioned with Andrew Blick and John Davis, we started the number 10 is conspicuously absent in taking history seriously, even though Campbell Bannerman, Prime Minister, introduced the photographs or portraits or paintings of or engravings of Prime Ministers on the stairs at number 10. It's been conspicuously weak. And one of the things that I did was to chair about 30 seminars so that those in number 10 could have a greater sense of history. The last was just before lockdown by Peter Frankopan of the Silk Roads and More. And his last question from the audience was, what should we most be afraid about with China? And he said, actually, what we should most be afraid about is not China. This was December 2019. He said, it's not China. What we should be most afraid about is a pandemic. And I'm also chair of the National Archive Trustees since 2019, and our job there is to get the archives out of queue and make them the people's archives, to tell the national story, but also the story of all the constituent elements that go to make up the country. So that's making me enormously interested in this topic. And at the moment, I'm working with the civil service policy profession to produce a series of 3 blogs with Ian Forbes and Sally Kershaw, who might be listening. So those are the elements that have kept me interested, keenly interested in this whole topic. And it's a sense of trying to complete the work that that Peter and we were building on the work of many great people before, including Otto Clarke, Richard Clarke, Charles Clarke's father. Next, I want to just draw our attention to 2 different models of history when we're looking at the uses that Whitehall and beyond might make of history. The first model is a focus on the past, to get the past in a better shape, and the focus on raw materials and the record. And we can see that in the series of official documents, official historians, starting in the Foreign Office from 1918 onwards. Official histories started in 1909 and coming up to the Falklands War by Laurie Friedman, and the history of the EU. And what I'd note about those is that they're good, but they're not good enough. No use was made of Stephen Wall's brilliant volumes when planning the Brexit, or indeed thinking about the referendum, but let's not go there. And it's hard to see much use has been made of Friedman's Falklands War. And yet we hear about talks of official histories on Northern Ireland. So there's that. I mean, it's clearly important. I'm not going to be talking about that. I would just merely note, not least with my National Archive Trust hat on, that we need to be doing a better work about keeping a tab on what documents really matter with digitisation and with more and more key messages are being lost on mobile phone calls that are unrecorded. I want to talk about the second model, which is, and it's marvelous that that work does happen, but my focus today is the second model, which is history as a tool to enhance decision-making and to move to that policy-informed decision-making rather than, history-informed decision-making rather than history light, or indeed worse, history ignorant, and at best history-rich decision-making. We then, I think, have to ask ourselves why there is comparatively little of that second kind of history, and why Whitehall has been negligent of it in the 100 years, largely negligent, 100 years since the First World War. There was, as you will all know, a very good study of this by Catherine Haddon, etc., in 2015 at the Institute of Government, and would certainly draw your attention to that work. And talking to Catherine yesterday, she said that her concerns about loss of institutional memory have not been assuaged, at least not been assuaged since the publication of that 7 years ago. So I think we can say that there are perhaps 10 reasons why more serious attention has not been given to history. The first undoubtedly is the political cycle, the short termism with elections every 5 years, there's little time or interest to reflect back. I mean, why on earth and how on earth is that going to get a government re-elected? Second is the highly initiative-driven policy-making process with ministers and officials, indeed, as Jonathan Slater, latterly PEMSEC at DFE, reminded us a couple of months ago. The focus is on sparkling new initiatives as a way of promotion. Ministers are keen to obviously impress number 10. Number 10 travels very history light. And there isn't that motivation or incentive to consider. Thirdly, a lack of time and the expense of considering history, to which the answer is that were Whitehall to plan ahead more, plan ahead to the next foot and mouth, to the next epidemic. One of Jeremy Haywood's biggest concerns, he told me before he died, obviously, he's not up here with me now, was that the lack of long-term thinking and planning on precedent. And so that can happen. And on money, well, yeah, it can be, it can take money to get the historical dimension in, but you will save much more money by getting it in. Then we've got, fourthly, the churn and the inexperience of prime ministers and ministers and officials. This fact is stunning, and one has to, I'm sure, check it. But if you check it, you'll find that it's true. The last 5 prime ministers between them have only served in 3 departments altogether. The 5 before them had served in 23, and the 5 before them in 38. There's an extraordinary collapsing of experience. Prime ministers we're about to see quite likely another churn in a prime minister. They are not there often long enough. Less than half have served 5 years. All the most effective were in office for more than 5 years and considerably more. Same with secretaries of state. Yet if we look at, for example, since 1900, there have been 15 education secretaries, average just over 1 year, 14 health secretaries, 18 welfare secretaries, 12 foreign secretaries, 14 home secretaries, and 15 defense secretaries, averaging just over 2 years. Little time to build the relationships, to build an understanding of the issues, the age of many. This is no criticism whatsoever, just a comment on the cabinet secretary, head of the Home Civil Service, Simon Case, in his young 40s when appointed. And of course, the number of departments that come and go, leaving no trace. All those have militated. That's a 4th factor. The 5th would be the distrust of history, the contempt, indeed, and historians. The present government regards the profession and most historians in it, apart from a short list, as tainted by wokeism and not worthy of, sadly, with honourable exceptions, no doubt some on this talk today. Then 6thly, look at what then is taking the place of history. Well, think tanks. So 60 years ago, 1962, there was barely anything more than the Fabian Society and the Institute of Economic Affairs. 60 years later, there are 126, all fizzing with ideas, usually history light ideas, impressing them on their client ministers. Special advisors, 60 years ago, there was 0, now there are 113, highly politicizing that decision-making process. Then 7thly, the whole history is highly, as Duncan and Simon and others have pointed out, highly dependent on sponsors. I mentioned Otto Clarke. but Nick Macpherson's support as Perm Sec for the history work in the Treasury was key, which of course had been killed off in 1976 by his predecessor, Douglas Wass. Jeremy Hayward was very supportive. Peter Ricketts as Perm Sec at the Foreign Office. And when you lose those people, as we found in number 10, we lost Jeremy Hayward, and you particularly lose the principal private secretaries who are interested, someone Chris Martin, who tragically died of cancer age 42, you lose the sponsor, you lose the interest. It is contingent on the core individuals, the ministers or the secretaries of state. Decline of the number of historians in government with an interest in history and their replacement by economists and others. 2/3 of the Treasury were historians or classicists 50 years ago. Now the figure is less. Number 9, really charging through these REF, research excellence framework, focusing very much on university impact as the denoter of worth in research. And it's very hard to prove whether Maplin Airport or anything else, the impact of one's research in history. History often doesn't work in that way. And then 10th is a decline, which Philip mentioned, in the quality and the grabbability of the archival record. Okay, let's look at some bad examples, looking at the time there. Bad examples, Millennium Dome. I'm just going to pick them up from the 21st century. Ivor Crewe wrote a really remarkable book with Tony King, two politics professors, on the blunders of government. And he said, I don't recall politicians and officials using historical reference frames when formulating or implementing any of the policies that led to the blunders that we described in our book. Even the Millennium Dome, overseen by Peter Mandelson, grandson indeed of Herbert Morrison, who oversaw the Festival of Britain in 1951, nor indeed references to the Great Exhibition of 1851. So in some of the worst episodes of government, no referencing there. Then on to the Iraq War. Tony Blair famously had a lunch with Jacques Chirac, who said, Tony, I know war. I have fought in Algeria. I know Iraq. I know how if you take the head off the body, the arms, the legs will be fighting each other in that country. Blair's comment after the lunch to an aide was, poor Jacques, he really doesn't get it, does he? Another example would be the Syria decision, the decision not to attack after Assad had used sarin gas at Ghouta in East Damascus in August 2013. I've just written a play on this for Radio 4 coming out next month, without heroes and villains, but trying to just look at the process. There was no consideration there. There was no time, but there was no consideration of the way that Iraq in particular had poisoned the well. The 2016 referendum, the lack of planning hadn't drawn on the closeness of referenda in 1979 or 1997, particularly Wales. The departure from the EU, to me, it was, to all of us, it should be astonishing that the biggest decision that the British government was making for many years didn't consult, as mentioned, the official history, or Stephen Wall didn't consult historians, didn't consult officials. The number 10 blithely went ahead in a micro-light, tight team and thought somehow that they could do the whole thing themselves. And after 3 years, they didn't. Whereas had there been the humility to understand and respect those who know history and understand how the EU worked, it could have been done in a way that would have saved this country billions and billions of pounds. And the pandemic, the ignorance, Patrick Vallance was getting agitated from early January 2020 and kept saying to the Department of Health, we need to be doing something on vaccines, and they came back and told him to keep calm, to cool down. And then when in March he exploded, he said that they said, no, don't worry, we've got flu vaccines. And that wasn't what was needed at all. Then 6 reasons why it matters, history implicit in what has been said already. You avoid repeating errors is the first reason. Second is it provides international context for contemporary decision making, looking at forces decision makers to look abroad. Thirdly, history is present even if not acknowledged or subconsciously acknowledged. Suez in 1956 is often given as an example for why one shouldn't take history seriously, because Anthony Eden was full of the example of the dictators. But in fact, had historians been at his elbow, they'd have pointed out that that analogy 18 years before was utterly stupid and false, and there were much better analogies. Fourthly, history informed decision making will make policy less jerky and less capricious. Fifthly, it will optimize the utilization of what works and what works best and what has worked. And finally, sixth and finally, it does build esprit de corps. I was very much conscious of that in number 10 and introducing those history series and building history of esprit de corps, whether in a department, is valuable in any institution, any organization, any family. To know about your past, where you've come from, builds a sense of identity. And indeed, arguably, the national story is light at the moment. And then I think I won't endure the time, Philip, I'm precisely on 25 minutes since I started, talk about, I'll merely say that that the best work is being done in the State Department's Foreign Commonwealth Office, excellent work by Patrick Salmon on both kinds of models, Model 1, but Model 2 with Black Lives Matter and the merger with international development and the Ukraine crisis, leading to a great spur of interest in history. We know about the work, excellent work, started by Duncan and others in 2011-12 with seminars which are richly informing history, and then the 2015 work with KCL overseen by John Davis and others. MOD has probably the longest continuous record of consultation with the 3 services historical branches. Home Office, very interesting work, started in 2013 with learning from previous experiences initiated by Mark Sedwill, then Permanent Secretary, later Cabinet Secretary, now no longer Cabinet Secretary. So that is bang on 25 minutes, much left out, but I hope that is a bit of a stimulus there, Philip.
It certainly is. There's a huge amount to think about and talk about. And please, if I could ask members of the audience, to write down questions in the chat function. We'll take them after the panelists have spoken. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists in turn to respond to some element of what Anthony has said, maybe drawing on your own experience, for no more than 5 minutes, please, and then we will have time for a discussion at the end. So I'm going to start with Andrew Blick. Andrew, please, do come in.
Thanks, Philip. Thanks for being here. Great to hear from you, Anthony. Really, really fascinating. I think obviously it's absurd that we even have to make the case for the importance of history. Would we have to make the case for the importance of physics to the conduct of government? I mean, I think it's obviously very silly, because history shapes where we've got to, where we are, whether we want to admit that or not. That's what's going on, and also shapes our perceptions, and also our perceptions of what history is, whether right or wrong, shape what we do. So all those things are incredibly important. What can we do about it? Well, History and Policy, Simon's one of the founders. Obviously, all the many years of work he did before that, Anthony fed into that along with Peter Hennessy, and that's broken down, I think, a lot of those barriers, in that we now do get in the door, we do get into discussions with civil servants, and it's taken a bit, I think, more seriously than it was in some ways. Although I totally accept all your points about the pushback that was there as well, Anthony, and the cultural problems that exist still to resist to what we're trying to do. But I think we probably need to think, well, yeah, there are these things that are working against our influence. So what can we do about it? I think one thing to think about is, what is the format in which we could deliver what we're doing to policymakers? So yes, we've all written books. Realistically, are those books going to be read? You know, is that the way to reach them? I'm not telling anyone to cease writing books, but it's really useful to think about the format and what is the stage at which what we're doing, in whatever format we might develop, could actually be useful. What's the point at which it should be integrated into what's going on? What's the stage in the policy making process? Maybe more than one stage, but I think these are things we could be thinking about, the format and then the timing within that. And I think all of that comes some way before we get to thinking about structures and do we need a chief historical officer and those kind of things. I think we should deal with some of those other things before we even get to there. And we should ask ourselves very seriously, would that be useful? What would that person be? Because it sounds good, but what would that person be doing? Who would they be? You know, what would their function be? Would there be a conduit between Whitehall and the outside world? Look at the role of chief scientific officer. Can we imagine a historian in that role? Is that a useful thing? Also, as historians, we can look at how these things, how the role of chief scientific officer developed, and actually how controversial that role has been at certain points in the past, and how sometimes it's been felt that the wrong, I'm not talking about present people, but how in the past it's been felt that the wrong person was in that role, and actually that person was actually, you know, a problem, and you know, sort of actually created a barrier between ministers getting the right and the right advice they might get. So all those things are useful to think about. And also, I suppose, as historians, we can think about, we shouldn't give up on this, that we can make progress. It took the Second World War to get Keynes into government. There was a lot of resistance to him prior to that point, maybe not as much as the caricatures suggest, but you know, that's what it took for J.M. Keynes to actually become an economic advisor in the Treasury, and unpaid. But so, you know, it's useful thinking about the fact we shouldn't just give up on this project, you know, and it may take a while to achieve it. I'd also add there, am I running out of time now? How long have I got, Philip? I can shut up in a minute.
You've got 1 minute.
Okay, good. So finally, we're not entering a vacuum. Lots of, although maybe less than was once the case, lots of politicians and civil servants do have history degrees, but we've got to make sure that it's used in a way that we think is right as professional historians. There's a lot of history out there. Not all of it is the history we would necessarily approve of, but it's, you know, it's there, so it's up to us to counteract it. And obviously, Simon Case does have a PhD in history, studying under Peter Hennessy. So, you know, it's there's hope in there, things we can work with.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew, and thank you for keeping so precisely time. Juanita, can I bring you in now, please?
Sorry, I had to work out how to unmute myself then. Yeah, thank you so much for that fascinating talk, Anthony. I thought it was really interesting, Andrew, when you're saying, what format do we deliver this history in? I'm thinking really of the Windrush scandal in terms of the things, I mean, we can see that a poor understanding of history is what's led to the Windrush scandal. So, you know, the Wendy Williams report talked about the, you know, institutional ignorance, the thoughtlessness that led to thoughtlessness towards the issues of race and the history of the Windrush generation. And I would sort of argue that the government have wasted a lot of money in not understanding that history, because surely the consequences have been a lot worse, whether it's in terms of poor health, whether it's in terms of the compensation scheme, whether it's the fact that a lot of the people that got caught up in this scheme missed out on education that they could have been productive towards society. So, I mean, maybe there's some sort of, I don't know, economic business case for pushing history within government. But also, I was just thinking in terms of, you know, are they interested in actually listening to it? I mean, I wonder sometimes when I look at the Windrush scandal itself, and you look at the numerous times that the government were approached by people like the Runnymede Trust, by the JCWI, by other charitable organizations who are warning that their policy plans were likely to cause problems. Is it that they just don't want to know the history or to understand it? But I'd also argue for the importance of oral history. I know we're sort of very interested in archival history, but I think one of the things that I found from doing this particular research is that we need to understand things like why or how the Windrush scandal happened in terms of, you know, changing legislation. Were they not aware of the changing legislation? Why not? And so in exploring things like that, coming to understand that people have different, within the community, don't necessarily follow mainstream media. And in doing these oral histories and asking questions about, you know, what are your sources of current affairs, then beginning to find out that actually a lot of them use sort of music as their sources of, you know, current affairs, whether it's, I don't know, just thinking of a name off the top of my head, but the importance of figures like Linton Kwesi Johnson, various Calypsonians, and there's actually an event happening, I think, this weekend in Sheffield, in which the communities decided, okay, a lot of people aren't aware of the compensation scheme, and so they're pushing it through the fact that they know a lot of people attend events that are surrounded, are sort of hitched onto the issue of music. So yeah, and I'm just also just concerned in terms of what was being said. You know, we need to, I'm thinking of like Savannah Dan talking about we're here because they were there, and that whole lack of understanding of British colonial history. Wendy Williams talking about the need to understand that. And I think for me personally, a lot of that is to do with addressing issues of race and racism. And it seems to me that, for example, within the Home Office, that people are slightly nervous around the term racism, as they appear to be across the country just generally. But as people like, I don't know, there's Freddie Folks, who's written a great article called The Emigration State, Race, Citizenship and Settler Imperialism in Modern British History. And he sort of looks at the kind of period from 1815 to 1972. And I actually think that broader period is even more important than the period I think Wendy Williams was looking at. She's kind of looking at a narrower period of history, but it covers that kind of the issues of racism. And I think that's really important in terms of understanding why the Black community is nervous about approaching the Home Office in itself. But yeah, so several different disconnected thoughts in my head. But also, you know, just also if we're trying to understand why there would have been poor reception, for example, to the Tony Sewell report on race. And I know, for example, now the Home Office is looking at having these kind of diversity and inclusion training programs, but unless there's this sort of again, understanding the history of the Black community and the suspicions that the Black community have around their relationship with the British state, if they don't then understand that history and reach out to the community, and rather than just thinking about public engagement, actually build proper relationships with the community where there's a large degree of transparency. Yeah, those are my kinds of thoughts. I don't know, Philip, if I'm waffling on a bit too much.
No, that's really helpful, Juanita. I'm sure we'll want to come back to some of those. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass on now to Duncan Needham from Cambridge.
Thank you, Philip. So I'm going to touch on some of the points that have already been raised, and also draw upon this rather marvelous book by Peter Beck called Using History Making British Policy, which looks at the history of history within the Treasury and the Foreign Office. I'm going to talk with particular reference to my own engagement with the Treasury. As Anthony very kindly mentioned, we've run a series there for about 10 years now. And just sort of explaining to my thinking as to why the Treasury has and continues to think that history is important. And then I'll just spend a few moments perhaps outlining why I think it works, if that's not too arrogant. Why is the Treasury historically engaged with historians? Well, I think the perhaps rather pious and optimistic hope is that it's going to augment the policy process. And as Anthony's already mentioned, it's very difficult to prove that. It's very difficult to prove your impact. We might want to come back to that in discussion. There's certainly a desire when reading back to the setting up of the Treasury historical section that it would augment the collective memory. I mean, it genuinely shocked me the first time I went into the Treasury to give a seminar to find out that the majority of Treasury officials in the room had not gone through an electoral cycle. And that's a bit like in my previous career as an investment banker, not going through an economic cycle. You know, you can't do your job properly as a banker if you haven't gone through an economic cycle with recession and a boom, in my view. So it's about augmenting the collective memory, and that's why they come and talk to us. But most importantly, and a couple of people have touched on this already, is Sir Norman Brooke, the permanent secretary, who was instrumental in setting up the Treasury historical sector, said, talking to historians will save time, and if we save time, we shall save money. And it really is as simple as that. He introduced a system of seeded files so that people knew where to look. And it's interesting that the Festival of Britain was mentioned. The second Treasury historical memorandum that was ever written was on the Festival of Britain and why it had cost so much money. So the fact that that document wasn't then drawn upon is very disappointing. Now, why does our current collaboration with history and policy and the Treasury work reasonably well? First of all, it's collaborative. They come to us with a topic for each annual seminar series. And for me, it's always very interesting to know, what's uppermost in the Treasury's mind. We've had sessions on austerity at the start of the Conservative Liberal coalition when austerity was at the top of their agenda. We looked at previous austerity episodes. We've looked at productivity problems in the past. We've looked at difficult treaty negotiations with Europe in 2016, which was particularly apposite at the time. They come to us with a topic. So it's not necessarily historians kind of riding their hobby horses or trying to ride their hobby horses into the Treasury. They come to us with a topic, and we go and find historians to talk about historical episodes. Secondly, it's accessible. And I'm thinking we had a Treasury seminar this lunchtime, so we just come from one, on the development of the railways in the northeast of England to coincide with the opening of the Treasury's new office up in Darlington. Obviously, the Stockton and Darlington Railway was a key moment in the history of the railways. You've got professional historians talking to many non-historians in the Treasury, often several hundred at a time. This is one of the silver linings of the pandemic. We're doing everything on Teams and on Zoom. We can get many more people at these sessions, but you're having to talk to people who are clearly intelligent. They're working for the Treasury, but not necessarily with historical training themselves. So it's accessible, it's collaborative, it's accessible. And then coming back to, and I have to come back to this point again, for them, it's free. We do not get paid for doing this. We'd love to get paid for doing this. In the 10 years that I've been involved in the Treasury series, only one person has ever said to me, am I going to be paid for this? And when I said no, they did it anyway. So it comes back to this point that and Juanita raised this. If they're getting this for free, and this will save money, as Norman Brooke pointed out in 1957, which I'm sure continues to be true, then I think there's a very good case for continuing to do it. And I will just pick up on, in my final 30 seconds, pick up on a point that's been made. It does require senior buy-in. So in my time, when I first got involved, Nick Macpherson was Permanent Secretary of the Treasury. He was just as important a figure in this history as somebody like Otto Clarke was in the 60s or Norman Brooke was in the 1950s. It requires very senior level buy-in to make it work. And we've got to maintain that momentum now. I think we have maintained that momentum that Nick is no longer there. So those are my brief points.
Thank you very much indeed, Duncan. I'll pass on now to Sally Sheard. Sally.
Thank you very much, Philip. It's lovely to be here. So as some of you know, and it's great to see the variety of people on the call today, I'm a slightly unusual historian. When colleagues introduce me, they will quite often say, Sally Sheard, she's Executive Dean of Institute of Population Health, but she's a historian. More recently, that has moved to, Executive Dean, and she's a historian, but they still quite can't get over this problem of having a historian running a population health academic department. So I would bill myself as an applied historian, and if I'm really cheeky, I can earn more in consultancy, working, advising local authorities, if I bill myself as a change analyst than I can as a historian. Image is critical. I've worked very closely with 3 former chief medical officers, and I'm really fascinated at this interface between expertise and policy making. And I think to provoke some discussion around some of the more practical aspects here, we need to really understand where and how to enter the policy making process. And I don't think we can do this without engagement with other disciplines. And certainly my own research has really benefited in recent years from discussions with policy scientists, looking at some of those analytical frameworks type that developed by Kingdon, multiple streams analysis, advocacy coalition, Carolyn Tui's work on the scale, pace, and place of policy change. And I suggest this because we need to approach history as a type of expertise, and we have to do it with an awareness that there has been a subtle shift that I don't think yet's been captured from evidence-based policy, which we think is the gold standard, to evidence-informed policy. And COVID has been the perfect exemplar of this tension between public political policy expectations of what following the science really means. And here I'm using science in that inclusive definition that science is knowledge and history is knowledge. So we are all scientists, but that's not the way that the government would see us. Certainly for the COVID response, if you look at the composition of SAGE committees, they didn't even have economists on at start. They certainly didn't have historians. There's an image perception around who historians are and what we do. Having been involved with local COVID policy development, it resonates very well with what Anthony was talking about earlier, a lot of the issues you raised, Anthony. I would also add here that technocrats prefer hard fixes, and that isn't easy to reconcile, I think, with our material and what we can do with historical context. What we can offer, which I think is equally valuable, at times more valuable, is an apolitical, a variant, a selection of options for policy choices that might move policymakers away from that sort of more narrow, deterministic, let's do what we've always done before. And it gets away from that political problem that the politicians have to be seen to offer something new. So I don't think we can continue to offer history just in the ways that we're currently doing it. I think the ways we're doing it are fantastic. The seminars have enormous value, but I'd draw the analogy to watching TV chefs. So many of us will sit there, we'll watch Jamie Oliver produce an amazing meal, and we'll think, oh, that's really good. I'll try that someday, but we never do. I think a lot of us, what we do with historians when we have those opportunities to talk to policymakers is we present them with the ingredients, but we don't necessarily show them the cooking methods and how then to build in the history into the final dish. So I would argue very strongly for a seat at the policy table, not just in the departments responding to requests for seminars, but actually being there in the policy making arena at those meetings. And we need then to have a new set of skills. We need to think about the language that we use to engage. We need to think about the formats. Andrew's right, books are good, but translating books into short opinion pieces is even better. So the challenge for me is very much about putting history in at the start of policy making. And we need, as historians, to understand quite what that policy making process is and how it works more effectively. I'll stop there and hand over, I think, to Simon, who's now joined us.
Yes. Thank you very much, Sally. I'll bring Simon in and then I'll allow Anthony to respond to anything that he'd like to from what's been said already. Simon, welcome.
Yes, sorry about my self-inflicted wound. I couldn't get this going. Yeah, a bit tricky that I may. Both of the talks I've just heard agree with everything they've said. They're covering lots of excellent points. I'm going to be in danger of repeating. Maybe what I'll say is just a very short thing, and then somebody, perhaps Anthony, could ask me a question if they want, which will presumably relate to something we haven't already talked about, and perhaps I can try to answer it. So all I really wanted to, I think what I can safely say, in addition to what I've heard, is that I think I would like to really labour on the issue of resource. After 20 years of being involved with history and policy, and getting buy-in from as many as 500 of our fellow historians, which when we started was not at all sure, because the history profession had got itself 20 years ago into a space, and that would have applied to 40 years ago as well, that involvement in policy was a rather grubby issue that was compromising one's objectivity and really wasn't for proper scholars and so on. So when we launched History and Policy, we weren't sure we would get any buy-in of significance from fellow historians, and we have done. So it seems to me the history profession is up for this and is interested. But I think to do these things, we really do need significant resource, and government departments have not been at all helpful on that. And I sympathise with the austerity and so on that they've been put through, and I know that that's difficult for them. But it's also been extremely difficult for history and policy over the decades to actually find ways of funding itself. Really difficult. It's taken up a lot of my time over the 20 years and Pat Thane's time before that. And I think that unless something like history and policy gets some kind of resource to compare with, for instance, the resource the Institute for Government seems to have managed to get for itself, we are going to continue for the next 20 years with a lot of wishful thinking, some very good goodwill on the part of historians doing things, but not the capacity to actually maximize and deliver the knowledge that we have. And I agree entirely with Sally and of course Duncan about what they've said about the value of historical knowledge and the value that historians and their methods have to offer. But without the resource, it's really difficult, apart from one or two individuals like Sally and Duncan, to actually, get themselves heard by the policy-making body. Goodwill can take you so far, but there needs to be some form of strategy somewhere to resource historians speaking to the policy world. So I'll just stop there because I'm hoping that hasn't repeated what's already been said. And if anybody would like to ask me something that they feel hasn't yet been addressed, I can try to respond to that. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to join earlier.
Well, no, Simon, it hasn't really been raised. And it is the $64,000 question, almost literally. Anthony, would you like to respond to any of those comments, and then we'll take questions from the floor?
Well, I think much better to have questions from the floor. If I will do this in under 2 minutes, really appreciated and made copious notes from those from the 5 of you, and thank you. Simon Case, clearly it is good, and we should exploit the fact that we have a cabinet secretary who gets government, did his doctorate, as Andrew reminded us, with Peter Hennessy, and taking Duncan's point about the necessity of having benign forces, or indeed active forces. We could certainly milk that more. Hope you're listening, Simon. I loved also what Juanita was saying about everything, and with the National Archives, that, you know, we see that suspicion very much from the Black community. They are truly the people's archives. They're not the Southwest London archives, and that's a transition which it will be great to talk to you about. So I so agree with you on oral history, which is where I started my own academic journey. Sally, if I take one thing away, I'll take many though from here. It's your analogy with cooking, and how we can indeed help them to cook dinner. And I love what you say about, to which others was also saying, about the importance of language and the format, the way that we present, as well as being embedded early on. And from Simon, I just wonder whether from Hilary Cooper's and your book on After the Virus, we did mention whether history had been well enough embedded in the whole coronavirus story, and what we can take, and whether there'll be time for you just to reflect on your really important book there, and what we can learn from history. So, Philip, that was 2 minutes.
And Anthony, can I ask you a question? You mentioned these 3 blog pieces that you're writing for civil service policy profession. Why were you commissioned to do that, and what is the purpose of these pieces?
So Ian Forbes, I met at number 10. There's Ian Forbes, Sally Kershaw. Ian was very enthusiastic about the seminar series, with which Andrew Blick was very, a partner with me on, from history and policy, which I agree has transformed the landscape in the last 20 years. So Philip, they just asked me, I'd written a piece for a Festschrift about the use of history, or misuse of history in government, and how unconscious historical forces shaped history even when it wasn't being professionally used. Much better to have it openly used rather than to have a knee-jerk, ill-considered response. And so they asked me to write these 3 blogs. The first is on why it matters. The second is on how much is taking place already. And I think the Treasury is clearly in the lead, but there's very important work taking place in the Foreign Office, not least in response to the Ukraine and Black Lives Matter, as I mentioned, but also the merger with international development. But there's also work in the Home Office and Defence, but not forgetting what international trade and transport. And it's trying to bring it all together. So the second one looks at the reality of how much is there today, and the third is what we should do about it. And I agree with the comments that were mentioned there about, Andrew mentioned about chief historian, that David Cannadine raised, was it 10, 15 years ago. I come down more with Sally on that. Well, I come down with also Juanita about the importance of democratizing this, and with Sally about getting us embedded in every department. If we have a grand figure who is chief historian writing a lot in the press, that I think will have much less effect than if really good historians are embedded and giving that professional advice behind the scenes, giving apolitical options. It's bound to improve the policy making process. So that's that's why I was asked by them, and what the three pieces will say, why it's important, how much there is at the moment, which is more than people think, and thirdly, what can we learn to make it much better in the future, to move towards, Simon, what I was saying at the beginning about a policy, a history considered policy making process, and ideally a history rich policy making process.
If I could just briefly respond to that. Thanks, Anthony. I think that it links to the issue I was trying to raise about resource, because it seems to me that if government departments themselves are not resourcing their own, proactively their own history of policy, because they've got all these files, a lot of them, unfortunately, you know, they're less rich since the era of the internet and email. But there are government files for most departments, particularly I mean, I know brand new departments will have to draw on others. If they're not devoting any resource at all to curating their own policy history, to having someone who can say, well, actually 5 years ago, we did have a policy for young children and it went like this and so on, then, you know, that's kind of really saying rather a lot about their attitude towards history and its use for them. So that I think the idea of embedded historians in each department is an excellent one. And one of the first things I would imagine that any half-decent embedded historian would say is, where's your archive? What state is it in? How can it be searched by, not just by me as a historian, but by your officials whenever they are contemplating a new policy? How can they search the archive to see what has been done before? Because, you know, that is the beginnings of a kind of historicist attitude towards what they're doing in government. So I would sort of, you know, say this is, it's part of the, also part of the resource issue of government departments understanding that, you know, to actively engage with history is not something that comes for free and is just out there. On the issue about history and COVID and so on, well, one of the really interesting things that happened during COVID was that I was almost flooded with material from fellow historians. We published a colossal number of policy papers and opinion pieces, particularly during 2020. And so that was, you know, a really nice example of a big issue with obvious historical dimensions to it, catalyzing and activating historians to get, you know, to devote some time to producing these policy papers and so on. And that was a great help to Hilary and me when we wrote the book, because, you know, actually having edited a lot of those things, you know, quite a few of them turn up in our book. They're extremely helpful. And, you know, writing the book, of course, Hilary is actually an ex-civil servant, a policymaker and a trained economist. So it was also an example, I think, of what Sally's saying about applied history and working with other disciplines, that probably for historians to do really good, relevant, hard-hitting history and policy work, it's ideal to get teamed up with somebody in the policy world who is sympathetic and knowledgeable, and to work together. And that, of course, is an effort. It's not easy, but I think you know, it's something that's well worth doing.
I'll let Sally and Andrew come in a minute, but it speaks to a question that's just come in from Avril Newton, or it's more of a comment really, who says, get out of your ivory tower. Ask politicians, civil servants, why they can't be bothered listening to historians. Ask them what they need to know. Ask them how they get information. The biggest problem is lack of time. They don't have time to read books. Make it clear where you can add value, save money, save their money. Is it that historians aren't listening to civil servants enough? I mean, what do you think about that, Anthony?
I think Avril is absolutely on the ball there. And we have to be responding, but there has equally to be that need. We can't just arrogantly come in and say, you must be interested in this or you're stupid,
yeah.
English, or a Brexiteer, or whatever pejorative word we might have. We have to be responsive, but we can only respond if there is that need. So how can we create the climate amongst officials? We're seeing it at the moment in the Foreign Office, where the historical section are being inundated by requests on fourth flag operations and refugees and governments in exile. Once that culture, I think it's cultural change, Avril, so that there is that interest and appetite to talk to historians, but we are essentially responding to what their concerns are rather than necessarily initiating it, with the exception, I think sometimes we can see longer term. So there was a long gap between the flu, I mean SARS, etc., but a long gap between Spanish flu and COVID. But historians would have said we need to be thinking more about this in advance. So I think it's more than just responding. It's thinking about what might be coming up.
Can I ask you just a follow-on question on that, about the attitudes of government to the universities? I mean, the people I follow on Twitter have been madly reacting to this blog piece by the university's minister, Michelle Donnellan, on Conservative Home, which is entitled Increasingly Universities a Place Where You're Told to Think Rather Than Taught How to Think. And they see this as part of the present government sort of culture war against universities. Do you feel that you've had kind of long experience of dealing with government since the 1980s at least? Is this government more hostile to academics in general, to the humanities in general than previous governments, or has there always been a kind of distrust there, almost a mutual distrust?
There's often an overlap between attitudes towards the academy to attitudes towards the civil servants. So we saw that with Thatcher. I mean, any tribal government will have a tribal mindset towards the academy and towards the status quo, the blob pejoratively described, including the BBC. And I think it's higher now, in part because of the enormous polarization of Brexit and the perception that the academy, including the historians, were on the wrong side of it. And there were precious few historians, Nigel Biggar being an example. A rare exception, Jeremy Black, maybe Andrew Roberts, Simon Heffer, who they do find acceptable, almost all male, if not exclusively male. So I think there is that, and I think it's troubling. And rather than our best response is, rather than getting angry about it, it's to show empirically that it's unjust and untrue and unfair. There clearly has been a besmirching of civil servants and the ethos of public service in general. So I think it's wider than just universities, and it's deeply unhelpful and disrespectful. And I think we need to be the grown-ups in that debate and show that it's untrue rather than just adding to it.
Thank you. Sally, you've been waiting to come in. Please.
Thank you, Philip. And I'll take this opportunity to respond to a couple of the questions in the chat, as well as to some of those replies that Anthony and Simon have made. So I think on this issue about not just being reactive to requests from government to be involved, we can't just be reactive, because it's that old, chestnut of the known unknowns. I just think there is so little institutional memory now that we cannot rely on government bodies to come to historians and say, tell us about the context of this issue, because they will be undoubtedly missing out on a much wider, richer set of historical materials. Secondly, the point that Simon made about being flooded with those COVID history pieces. Yes, Simon, there have been huge numbers of historical pieces written about COVID, comparisons with 1918 influenza, all of that. But where's the impact? How do we actually see what has been used from those pieces in policy responses on COVID? And I think that's a challenging piece of work to do, but I think it's an important one. And then third, the issue about payments. So I maybe didn't stress this enough in my 5 minutes, but if you ask, you will be paid. We know the budgets that government departments have for consultancy is phenomenal. The trick that we're missing is that we're not asking regularly, and we're not asking at the right levels. And every time I've been asked to do some work, either for central or local government, I've always asked for payment. I've always modelled it on what my university says is a reasonable consultancy rate, and I've always been paid. So I'll leave it there and let Andrew, I think, wanted to come.
It's a very good point. I'm sure almost everyone in this meeting, when it ends, will go off and rebrand themselves change analyst on their CVs. Andrew, over to you.
Hi, thanks. Just saw a couple of questions in the chat, so I wanted to respond to.
Take up some of the things that in the chat, Andrew.
Well, actually, Avril Newton's point, absolutely, this is exactly what I thought. We need to think about the format, what form they need it in, that, we just can't expect busy people to have read a whole book. And books are great, as I say, but is that necessarily the right format anyway to convey what we want to convey? And that ties into a point further down about the kind of the collective memory issue of the formats being used, the WhatsApps, the self-deleting messages, so on and so forth. How's that going to be stored? And I think it's a slightly distinct debate from the one we're having to debate today, but I think it's important as historians we should be thinking about this, what is being stored, what's being lost. And that also relates to the way in which politicians and civil servants, like everyone else out there in society, communicates with each other now. And that's the format we should be thinking about. How can we get into there if we want to influence people? That's where we need to be. And I'd also add this discussion about, I think another important point Anthony made about think tanks is, well, why don't we try and get out there and infiltrate think tanks and work with think tanks, which I know some people are doing, but there's other ways into influence than just trying to go directly to government. And if there are other paragovernmental or think tank organisations out there doing this, which I suppose is in a way the kind of space history and policy has been in anyway, but that's a way in as well. There are other ways of influencing. And I'd throw in there an often useful source way in I found is parliamentary select committees who always bang this drum, but they need evidence, that they thrive on evidence from people such as ourselves and other people, and they'll be grateful you're doing them a favour. Won't get paid for that, unfortunately, Sally. But by the way, I agree entirely with your point there. And I suppose a minor point on my area. When you're constitutional history, when you're dealing with the constitution, particularly a constitution like our one, which is so-called unwritten constitution, very much precedent-based, history becomes very useful, because if you're going to justify something or criticise something, you often end up referring to whether there is a precedent, whether it's the right precedent, or whether there's no precedent, etc., etc. Has a prime minister ever been indicted for a criminal act in history? All these things crop up. When have people resigned for lying? All this stuff all comes up all the time. So history is kind of used there, and you do find often people within government want to talk about these things and want advice on these things. There are certain areas of government activity where it's still recognised that history is absolutely vital, if only to be able to make an argument.
Thank you very much, Andrew. There's Melita has written in the chat about her case study. I mean, Melita, would you like to unmute yourself and just explain to everyone your experience of working with government? Would you like to come up? If not, we can raise your hand at some point if you want to come
okay, sorry, I was unable to unmute because of the
don't worry. Good to see you. Yeah,
yes,
just maybe
hi,
because it sounds interesting. It sounds an interesting case.
Yes, so what I did is I'm from Canada, University of Alberta. And what we did is a study on patient portals, health information technologies being implemented quite a bit, and in the UK as well too. And one of the things that occurred is that we started having in Alberta 2 patient portals, one from the ministry and one from the healthcare organization. And they were competing against each other. But nobody would even stop and consider why there are 2 or why they're competing, but they were all doing it for the social good. So both of the reasons were valid. So at the end, what happened is I decided to do a historical study and present to the decision makers that an understanding of what is occurring and why it occurred, and give them some lessons learned and why one portal is more successful than the other. And however, I had to really balance between the ministry and the healthcare organization in order not to upset one or the other. So for me, the studies show that historical studies are actually balancing people's feelings most of the time in terms of organizations and in terms of delivery. And so it's at the end, what I did is I interviewed ministers and CEOs and ADMs, and they accepted the findings, and they kind of stopped and thought about it. Okay, why do we have 2? And although there's still 2, now they're merged under 1. And so kind of slowly there's an understanding, but other organizations now, other ministries are asking for the same thing to happen, to somebody to come in and to do that historical understanding of why programs, interventions are being implemented by different ministry, but although they serve the same purpose. So that was my study.
That's really interesting. And it sort of suggests that in order to be effective in communicating with government, you've got to understand the structures of government in order to do that in a sort of sensitive way.
Yeah, and it's not about upsetting anyone. It's actually bringing the truth forward.
Yeah.
And it showed that it can be done. In my paper, I can put a link where I published.
Yeah.
Actually, I show how one side sees the other side as the little child, not playing well with others or things like that. But even though they're the same government, the same provincial government, but it allowed an opportunity for the truth to come out.
Thank you very much for that. It's really interesting. I've got Ian Forbes is with us, and Ian often says something a little bit more about you know, what the civil service policy profession is doing. Ian, would you like to come on?
Hi Phil, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for the contributions from the speakers. Really interesting stuff. So I'm a serving civil servant in the Department for Transport, and working with a broad grouping called the Policy Profession, which is a team within Whitehall that looks to try to professionalise different aspects of policy making across a range of different fronts. And the reason that we've been speaking to Anthony and some others on the call actually about history is because Tamara Finkelstein, who's the Prem Sec of DEFRA, and Gareth Davis, who works in my department of transport, are very passionate about the idea of learning from policymaking past when thinking about what to do in future. And I share the view that it's not common enough for a senior civil servant starting in a new policy area just to review what his or her predecessors did when facing similar challenges, which does lead to a little bit, I think, of an unfortunate case where we're kind of living in the eternal present. and trying to deal with issues afresh. And there's lots of activity going on across Whitehall, some of which I've been privileged to work on people on this call with. But as people have said, a lot of it is dependent on individual passionate people wanting to try and generate conversations rather than something which is a bit more professional. And the reason that we were keen to invite Anthony to write some material for us, or one, because we wanted to start a conversation, but more than that, I think wanted to do a bit of publication to generate some discussion within Whitehall departments about whether there's more that can be done here. And I share, for what it's worth, the analysis that people have been saying about some of the difficulties, but I think it's really important to open up that conversation and to have it with policymakers too. So great if there are future versions of this particular topic, which are a bit of a dialogue between historians and policymakers about what works, what doesn't work from their perspective. And as a final comment, if I may, so I think Sally's comment about how to approach Whitehall departments. I think one of the reasons maybe why some of the formal structures around history making have fallen off recently is to do with the managerial kind of nature of the civil service and how it's changed over time. And that does mean, I think, that one of the ways in which it's useful to engage with departments in the future is to think about how managerially we engage consultants and other people to get things done. It's just the language that's often used, and that has its pros and cons, but certainly if you're looking to try and plug in, can be an effective consideration when thinking about how to increase the.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks for joining us. And I hope we can work together with with our network in history and policy to help you do that. There's a question. Simon, do you want to come in?
Yeah, it was just connecting up the points that were made about the ivory tower comment and the structures of government point you've made. I do think it's something that's been bothering me for quite a while. The black box of the policy process itself is not really understood, to my knowledge. I had a very able postdoc have a look at this 2 or 3 years ago, and the policy, what happens between some spark of an idea somewhere from somebody and a policy emerging at the end of, what is this sausage machine in the middle? And I'm sure it's different in different, departments and in different times and places, and as historians, we will all always know that. But I really don't think there's very much understanding of this at all anywhere. I mean, maybe the Institute for Government somewhere has done some work on this. It's the kind of thing they should. And we did, my history and policy colleagues will know that 3 or 4 years ago, we were trying to kind of move this forward with, I think, Hugh Pennington and so on. And Hugh was not well at the time, and it didn't really go anywhere. But I do think that for us as historians trying to access the policy world with our knowledge and so on, it's a dimension of the kind of the pool we're swimming in, the soup we're working with, to use the recipe idea, that we need to know much more about. And I don't know that anybody knows about it, apart from, I think it's just tacit knowledge on the part of civil servants and SPADs and so on, who work and live in these environments. They build a tacit knowledge of how this happens, and probably the people who become permanent secretaries have a particularly good tacit knowledge of how it happens. But there's very little, for us as historians to get to grips with about, how to do this. I mean, maybe, possibly Duncan, who has had a long period of working with one department and providing seminars for them, Duncan may have picked up some tacit knowledge along the way. But I do think it's quite a big problem that we're kind of addressing a black box.
And Sally referred to Kingdom's work on the policy process, and I know Chris Knowles, who I see is on this call, recently referred me to Kingdon's work as well as being very suggestive about how one could make interventions in that process. Sally, would you like to say something?
I would. I think, Simon, I put in the chat a link to a blog site that's run by Paul Kearney, who's at Strathclyde, Professor of Policy Science, where he unpicks in very short, neat pieces what is of value from those theoretical approaches such as Kingdon, Sabatier, Toohey. There is an enormous amount of literature out there. I think the challenge that we have as historians is it doesn't sit comfortably with how we write, very much more in the social science mode, where you show your workings up front, you talk about your methodologies in social science, you explain what your inclusion, exclusion, search terms are, how you've set your parameters, your hypothesis, and so on. We don't do that as historians. That's implicit. You have to read into the documents to see how we have used sources. I think we need to be open, and I've certainly tried to challenge myself in different styles of writing to engage with these pieces. So I'd suggest you go and have a look at some of Paul Kearney's blog pieces.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah,
I notice it's a 348-page text that you've
I've put the wrong link in. I meant to link to the original WordPress. I'll find the WordPress, Simon.
Thanks.
Thank you. We've nearly come to the end of our time. I'm just going to ask Anthony if you'd like to sort of say anything just to wind up or respond to anything that's been said recently.
How long do you want me to talk, Philip?
2 or 3 minutes. That's all.
You will have 2 or 3 minutes. It would be very good to have that link to Paul Kearney's blog, Sally. Fantastic. Great privilege to listen to everybody. I'd encourage those up to 100 or however many to submit, to write in and with thoughts and ideas. I think we have a moment here where we can capitalize post-Brexit, post-pandemic, I'd love to say post-Ukrainian war, but I mean, that itself is taking us to the biggest moment in international history for 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, the repivoting of world diplomatic relations and economic relations. We are at a moment. We do have a cabinet secretary who gets us. He's extraordinarily busy, but his predecessor, Simon Case, is the 13th cabinet secretary. The 4th cabinet secretary, Norman Brooke, his words, quoted by Duncan, are extraordinarily advantageous to us because they also make the economic impact case for us. I think what I'd like to see to conclude, Philip, as I said at the beginning, is none of us has the answer complete in ourselves. Together we can get towards the right way of, they do want us, they want to have our inputs, they want it in clear language, a single page on different issues of options and background, a 5 or 6 page follow-up, maybe appendices, written in clear, not jargon history or jargon academic language, and evidently fair and rooted in impartial evidence. I think if we join forces, history and policy, the policy profession, all those on the call here in different departments, KCL, Institute for Government, indeed, there will be enough of a momentum that will help government solve a problem to conclude that they know that they have, but they don't know how to solve it, which is how to embed ourselves in the policymaking process early on, as Juanita and Sally were saying, and inclusively do that in a way that will save money and make for more considered thoughtful policy rather than reactive policy. And let's just remember finally that premierships are all since the democratic era dawned in 1918-28. They've all burnt and left not at moments of entirely their own choosing, regretting for the rest of their lives, rueing what they haven't done. And almost to a woman and man, they would say that they wish they had been more considered. We are the considered profession. We give that perspective that is badly needed. So let's work together, Philip, and thank you so much for inviting me to do this, and everyone for joining.
Anthony, thank you so much for coming along, and I hope you'll come back as these blog pieces appear and talk to us some more, and particularly about your diagnosis for future action as well. And I think we'd be really interested to talk to you about that.
That's been much enhanced by listening to what everyone is saying here.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you, Andrew, Juanita, Duncan, Sally, Simon, for your input, and thanks for the excellent questions from the floor.